that in the early church, from the 1st century onward, all the Christians agreed that the Roman bishop had a specific role of primacy and leadership for Christianity as a whole. Hey guys, it's Lizzie. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Lizzie's Answers. In today's video, we will be answering the question, did the Pope exist in the early church? Was the Roman bishop's role from the 1st century onward similar to the modern day Pope? This might seem silly to anyone who's currently Catholic because we literally have a list of the succession of popes, starting with Peter, then Linus, Anacletus, Clement, all the way to Pope Francis. So yes, there are objective lists of the popes going all the way back to the 1st century. But many Protestant and Orthodox Christians will claim that there is not early evidence that these Roman bishops had authority over the other bishops and the church as a whole. A lot of people will make claims that the existence of a papal primacy is a later development, not starting until the 4th century. Then there's other people who will claim that the role of the Pope didn't begin until the 19th century during Vatican I, when the dogma of Papal Infallibility was officially defined. The year that a dogma is defined is not the year it originated. I made an entire video 2 summers ago talking about Papal Infallibility, the Council of Vatican I, so that's kind of a prelude to this video. I'm going to link it below, so make sure to watch it. In that video, I answered the question, is the Pope perfect? Do Catholics believe the Pope is perfect? No, we don't. Today's video is showing Christian writings from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, showing the supremacy and authority of the Roman bishop in the early church. So starting off with some biblical arguments. From the very beginning, the Apostle Peter is set apart and signified as a leader of the other apostles. His original name is Simon, and when Jesus calls him, he immediately changes his name to Peter, which means rock. Peter's 3 names, Simon, Peter, and Cephas, are mentioned 191 times in the New Testament, which besides Jesus is the most mention of any person's name. And if we compare this to the Old Testament, in Judaism, changing someone's name is highly significant and is God calling them to a specific leadership role. It's just interesting because Abram's change to Abraham was the beginning of the Old Covenant, and so as Catholics, we believe that Simon's name to Peter signifies the beginning of the New Covenant. Let me know if you want me to make an entire video on biblical arguments for the papacy. But some examples, in 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about how that after resurrecting from the dead, Jesus first appears to Peter before the other apostles. Then there's the epic passage in John 21 where Jesus is reconciling with Peter after Peter betrays Jesus, and Jesus very specifically says, "Feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep," which in the Old Testament, shepherding sheep is a huge metaphor of spiritual leadership. Luke 22, Jesus is calling out Peter as a leader, specifically saying that he is supposed to strengthen the other apostles. And then in the book of Acts, once the church has begun, Peter speaks for the other apostles and even gets a vision from God about the food laws, God directly speaking through Peter during an important debate in the early church. But the most important biblical argument for the Pope is Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. So like we talked about earlier, Jesus specifically changes Simon's name to Rock. And then he says, "On this rock, I will build my church." And then the Christian writings that we're going to read specifically cite this passage as evidence for the power of the Pope at the time. So these verses are being interpreted in the early church as being about the papacy. The most important part of that passage, though, is when Jesus says he will give to Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven, which is the connection to Isaiah. The keys of the kingdom of heaven denotes a leadership position in the Old Testament monarchy where there was a steward position, a second in command position to the king, who would walk around wearing physical keys to the kingdom. And if the king ever left the city, the steward was in charge. He was second in command until the king came back to the city. And if the steward died, another steward would replace him. So I hope this is becoming clear. Jesus ascended into heaven, he went away, and he left Peter, the steward, and then Linus, and then Anacletus, and then Clement, etc., to be the second in command steward position. Catholic biblical basis for the Pope. And now we're going to prove that in the early church, from the 1st century onward, all the Christians agreed that the Roman bishop had a specific role of primacy and leadership for Christianity as a whole. Clement's letter to the Corinthians is the earliest Christian document outside of the Bible, written around the year 95 AD, which is when the Apostle John is still alive. So super in the early church. And this proves, along with everything else, the role of the Roman bishop from the beginning. It reminds us of St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. They always had so many problems going on. And since then, the church has gone haywire. Some Christians there had tried to kick out their bishop and priest and take over. And so there's a rift going on in the church. Like I said, the Apostle John is still alive, who only lived 240 miles away. Rome is 600 miles away, but the Bishop of Rome, the head of Rome, is intervening, writing a letter to another church 600 miles away with authority. And in another early document from the early 2nd century called the Shepherd of Hermes, it also mentions Pope Clement. It says, "Write then 2 small booklets, one for Clement and one for Grapte." So I think Grapte is another priest in the community. "Clement will then send it to the cities abroad, since this is his duty. And Grapte will instruct the widows and orphans." Other Christians who attest to the legitimacy of this letter are Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Eusebius. Here are some choice quotations from the letter. "But if some be disobedient to the words which have been spoken by God through us, let them know that they will entangle themselves in transgression and no little danger. For you will give us great joy and gladness if you render obedience unto the things written by us through the Holy Spirit, and root out the unrighteous anger of your jealousy, according to the entreaty which we have made for peace and concord in this letter." And they even send 3 messengers from Rome to make sure that everyone obeys the letter and everything calms down in the community. "Make haste and send our messengers Claudius Ephebus, Valerius Vito, and Fortunatus back to us in peace and joy, so that the news of the truce and the unity for which we are praying and longing may reach us more speedily, and we may the sooner rejoice over your return to order." This is amazing, and the church at Corinth loved it so much that they read this at Mass for 400 years, and it even almost became part of the Bible. 15 years later, St. Ignatius of Antioch writes a letter that we call Letter to the Romans. He begins by going above and beyond, affirming and passionately honoring the church at Rome and what she represents. So this is the beginning of the letter. "Ignatius, also called Theophorus, to the church that has found mercy in the transcendent majesty of the Most High Father and of Jesus Christ, his only Son. The church, by the will of him who willed all things that exist, that is beloved and enlightened by the will of him that wills all things according to the love of Jesus Christ our God, which also presides in the chief place of the Roman territory, worthy of God, worthy of honor, worthy of blessing, worthy of praise, worthy of success, worthy in its holiness, and presiding in love, having the law of Christ, named after the Father, which also I agreed in the name of Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father. Quite the introduction to the letter. So the phrase presiding in love, also translated as preeminent in love, is used twice in this letter and also in one of Ignatius's other works. And if we actually look into the grammar and connotations and how it's used in other literature at the time, it's not just a cute, flowery word, but actually implies an authoritative role. In his epistle to the Magnesians, he uses the phrase, "Let the bishop preside in the place of God." Prokathomai implies authority and leadership, literally meaning to be seated in front of. Additionally, the word for love here, agape, has the before it, hey agape, the love, which should be taken to mean the community of love, the people of love. That's how it was used. The bond of love that the community of Christians have in the universal church. So Ignatius is saying that Rome is preeminent among the people of love, preeminent among Christians. Saint Ignatius goes on to define Rome as having every foreign stain filtered out of them, which can be taken to mean free of heresies, which is one of the most important parts of the Pope and Rome, where the Pope cannot be a heretic and never has been a heretic. Rome guards the orthodox teachings of the church. Then Ignatius bows to Rome's authority, which is crazy. If you've read other letters that Ignatius writes, he's extremely commanding and instructs people and tells them when they're wrong. Here he says, "Not like Peter and Paul do I issue any orders to you," which is so interesting because in the early church they saw not just Peter, but Peter and Paul as being part of Rome's authority, because Peter and Paul both preached in Rome, both martyred in Rome. The letter continues, "You have taught others. All I want is that the lessons you inculcate in initiating disciples remain in force." Calling the Pope Father. So the word Pope literally means father, and it's just like how we call priest Father so-and-so, but we specifically have the word Pope to signify honor for the Roman bishop. But for a lot of the communication in the early church, when they're writing to the Roman bishop, they'll just say the name or say Bishop so-and-so. But there are also 2nd century examples of calling the Pope Father. A letter from around the year 170 from a Christian named Dionysius addressed to Pope Soter, the Bishop of Rome at the time. He uses the phrase, "Blessed Bishop Soter," and then goes on to call him Father, saying, "Encouraging the brethren from abroad with blessed words as a loving father to his children." So 2nd century, calling the Pope Father, which is also very biblical. Paul and Peter refer to the Christians as their children. I made an entire video on "Call no man father," which is a Bible verse that Protestants throw at Catholics. So if you're interested in why we call priest father and the Pope Father, I will link that video below as well. This letter is recorded in Eusebius's church history, which I highly recommend. Church history is the best book I've ever read. I recommend it in so many videos, so go read Church History by Eusebius. Another 2nd century letter that's also been preserved in that book is by Bishop Pothinus writing to Pope Eleutherus, asking to accept a priest named Irenaeus, who's my patron saint. Basically, Irenaeus as a priest was carrying a letter from his bishop condemning a heresy called Montanism, and in that letter introducing Irenaeus, it says, "We pray, Father Eleutherus, that you may rejoice in God in all things and always. We have requested our brother and comrade Irenaeus to carry this letter to you, and we ask you to hold him in esteem as zealous for the covenant of Christ." So as I said in my last video talking about purgatory, I'm sure that there are so many other letters calling the Pope Father that we do not have anymore because all of this was 2,000 years ago, so many documents have been lost. But two that do remain are referring to the Pope as Father in the 2nd century. Another example of the Pope's primacy is in a book called Against Heresies, written by Irenaeus of Lyon, the Irenaeus who is delivering the letter, and that book is actually being used as my tripod to film this video right now. So we're gonna read some choice quotations in the book of him talking about Rome. He's fighting against this really powerful heretic group called the Gnostics, and he's accusing them of assembling in unauthorized meetings, so basically holding their own mass apart from the official bishops. Saint Irenaeus was born in the year 130, and he was taught by Polycarp, who was taught by the Apostle John. So we can trust that the teachings of Irenaeus are the teachings of the apostles. He's saying that Rome is preeminent, speaking of it as the tradition derived from the apostles of the very ancient and universally known church, founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also the faith preaches to men, which comes down to our time by means of the succession of bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority, that is, the faithful everywhere, inasmuch as the apostolic tradition has been preserved continuously by those faithful men who exist everywhere. Then he references Pope Clement's letter to the Corinthians as evidence of what he just said. After that, he lists the succession of popes from Peter onward to the current pope. Linus, Anacletus, Clement, Evaristus, Alexander, Sixtus, Telephorus, Hyginus, Pius, Anicetus, and the current pope, Eleutherius. He says Eleutherius is the 12th place from the apostles, which we just read 11 names, which means that he thought of Peter as the first pope. More evidence comes from the epitaph of Abercius, which we talked about in last video, in the Purgatory video. We also read a quote from it. So this is an inscription written on a grave by a Christian named Abercius. This was written between the years 190 and 200. This is very poetic and metaphorical. That's why I have some brackets in the quotation to tell you what he's talking about. My name is Abercius. I am a disciple of the Holy Shepherd who hears the flocks on the hills and plain, who has enormous eyes that penetrate everywhere. To Rome he sent me, to behold an empire and to see a queen in a golden robe and golden shoes. I saw there a people with a shining seal. Everywhere I found people who shared my beliefs, for Paul was my companion. So he's describing Rome as a queen in a golden robe and a people with a shining seal. So next we're going to talk about two controversies going on in the early church in which the Pope takes control. And it's really clear that everyone knows that the Roman bishop has some type of authority over Christianity. The first one occurred towards the end of the 2nd century. It's called the Easter Controversy. So churches in the East in Asia were wanting to celebrate Easter on the 14th day of the month, regardless of whether or not it fell on a Sunday. It was a Jewish Christian custom to celebrate on the same day as Passover, and they cited the apostles Philip and John, who had taught them that it's okay to celebrate on the 14th. This was a huge issue to the Bishop of Rome at the time, Pope Victor I, who I do not like. I think he handled it horribly. But the Easter controversy proves that the Roman bishop has the authority to excommunicate entire churches. Celebrating Easter on Sunday was more of a thing in the Gentile, non-Jewish regions. This is also coming from the church history book by Eusebius. Thereupon, Victor, head of the Roman Church, attempted at one stroke to cut off from the common unity all the Asian dioceses, together with the neighboring churches, on the ground of heterodoxy, and pillared them in letters in which he announced the total excommunication of all his fellow Christians there. So Pope Victor is writing a letter to all these churches saying, if you don't submit, you're excommunicated. Instead of Christians writing to him saying, you do not have the authority to do that, instead we see letters of people trying to convince him to calm down and be less severe in his penalty. Bishop Polycrates from Asia writes to Pope Victor and explains how the apostles Philip, the apostle John, Polycarp, and other famous Christians and martyrs celebrated Easter on the 14th, so therefore let us celebrate on the 14th. But then Irenaeus solves the Easter controversy and gets Pope Victor to chill out. By writing to him, he speaks of his mentor Polycarp visiting Pope Anicetus at the time, the Bishop of Rome. Polycarp is from Asia and was celebrating on the 14th and got along with that Pope at the time. So Irenaeus is not saying, you don't have the authority to excommunicate. He knows that Pope Victor, as the Bishop of Rome, has the authority to excommunicate entire churches. And he's working with that and asking him to instead make peace, which is what happens. And that's why still to this day, the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Church, celebrates Easter on a different day than the Western Church, the Catholic Church. Another pope, Pope Eleutherus, who was pope during the years 174 to 189, he condemned these iconic heretics, including Marcion and Valentinus. And there were churches writing to the Pope telling him to condemn these heretics. Because as we saw during the Easter controversy, the Pope has the power to excommunicate entire churches and entire heresies and entire heretics. Before we get into the second controversy, the baptism controversy in the 3rd century, I want to read a couple choice quotes from a Christian named Origen, who was living in the 2nd century and is one of my favorite early Christians. He writes, "Peter, upon whom is built the Church of Christ, against which the gates of hell shall not prevail." In another homily, he's speaking of Peter, and this is what he says: "Look at the great foundation of the church, the most solid of rocks, upon whom Christ built the church. And what does the Lord say to him? O you of little faith," he says, "why did you doubt?" 60 years after the Easter controversy is the baptism controversy, and it's even worse. There were major heretic groups at the time. So there were Christians who grew up their entire life in these schismatic groups, which is very similar to Protestantism today. And then when these Christians wanted to unite with the main church, the question arose, do they have to get baptized if they were already baptized in a heretic group? Is that a real baptism? Pope Stephen I, who was the pope from the years 254 to 257, he represented the Roman position, which was also the opinion of Alexandria and Palestine, that you do not have to get baptized again, that the first one was a legitimate baptism, and instead you just get absolution by the laying on of hands. Cyprian of Carthage, a Christian living in North Africa, argued the opposite position, that the first baptism wasn't a real baptism and they had to get baptized when unifying with the Christians. The Roman position won out and is still the position today, which is why when I converted into Catholicism, I did not have to get rebaptized because my Protestant Trinitarian baptism was a legitimate baptism. A Christian named Firmilian of Caesarea at the time, talking about Pope Stephen I, writes, "Who contends that he has the succession from Peter, on whom the foundations of the church were established, who claims that through succession he has the throne of Peter." And it's kind of funny, but Firmilian disagreed with him, and he even argued that Stephen is introducing many other rocks and betraying the unity of the church by validating these sacraments done outside of the main church. As I've talked about in a lot of my videos, establishing the New Testament canon was a gradual process, and for the first 300 years of Christianity, they didn't even have an official canon list. And so I say all the time, you can have the church without the Bible, but you can't have the Bible without the Catholic Church. So there are other books, like I mentioned, Clement's Letter to the Corinthians and the Shepherd of Hermas, that actually almost became officially part of the New Testament because they were read so much at Mass. But Rome's view of which books were canon is what ended up prevailing. Rome was one of the first churches to put together a list, mainly because the heresy of Gnosticism was rampant and the Gnostics had their own books that were Christian books, fake Christian gospels going on, and so it was in their best interest to come up with the legit list of books as a way to combat the heresy. And it's just interesting that the Roman Church's list of books is what ended up being our official canon. Something else going on in the 3rd century was, we'll call it the Penance Controversy. Pope Cornelius was the Bishop of Rome during the Decian persecution, which was the first systemic persecution of Christians during the Roman Empire. During this time, there were many Christians who denied their faith under persecution, or even bribed officials to write a certificate that they had done this pagan sacrifice. There were some bishops, some churches who wanted to refuse to ever let those Christians back into the church who denied the faith or bribed the officials. And there were other really big sins like adultery and murder, which in some churches, bishops didn't want to allow those people to come back into the Christian community. But Pope Cornelius, the Bishop of Rome, against the Novatians, his rule was that every sin can be forgiven. Everyone can be accepted back into penance. Tertullian was a Christian in the 2nd century, born in the year 160 and dying in the year 225. Here are a few quotes from him written around the year 210. But remember, he was living in the 2nd century church. This is in his prescription against heretics. If you are near Italy, you have Rome, whence also our authority derives. How happy is that church, on which apostles poured out their whole doctrine along with their blood, where Peter endured a passion like that of the Lord, where Paul was crowned in a death like John's, where the apostle John, after being immersed in boiling oil and suffering no hurt, was exiled to an island. Rome, whence our authority derives. And then in his Scorpius, he writes, "For though you think heaven still shut, remember that the Lord left here to Peter, and through him to the church, the keys of it, which everyone who has been here put to question, and also made confession, will carry with him." We also have writings from Saint Cyprian, who was born probably towards the end of the 2nd century and then died in 258. He's writing in his Unity of the Catholic Church. "If anyone considers and examines these things, there is no need for a long discussion and arguments. There is easy proof of faith in a short summary of the truth. The Lord says to Peter, 'I say to you,' he says, 'that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. And to you I will give the keys of the kingdom of heaven. On him he builds the church and commands him to feed the sheep. And although he assigns a like power to all the apostles, yet he founded a single chair, and he established by his own authority a source and an intrinsic reason for that unity. Indeed, the others were also what Peter was, but a primacy is given to Peter, by which it is made clear that there is one church and one chair. If someone does not hold fast to this unity of Peter, can he think that he holds the faith? If he deserts the chair of Peter upon whom the church was built, can he be confident that he is in the church? We can see Saint Cyprian living out his belief in Rome's primacy in 255 AD when a bishop in his region named Bishop Marcian of Arles refused to receive to penance some people who had committed horrible mortal sins. Bishop Marcian was permanently excommunicating people, refusing to accept them into penance, which was against the church's policy that Rome had decided. So Cyprian of Carthage, the biggest bishop in North Africa, instead of directly writing to this church and telling them to expel the bishop or demanding the bishop to accept people into communion, instead he writes to Pope Stephen I and asks him to write to Gal and excommunicate that bishop and choose a new bishop. Cyprian also writes of the Roman Church when Pope Cornelius is elected pope. He describes him as the matrix and root of the Catholic Church and says, "All our colleagues firmly approve and maintain you and your communion. That is, the unity and also the charity." Here's another letter from Saint Cyprian. "You wrote for me to transmit a copy of those same letters to Cornelius, our colleague, so that he might lay aside all anxiety and know at once that you held communion with him, that is, with the Catholic Church." In the same letter, he writes, "Cornelius was made bishop by the judgment of God and of Christ, by the testimony of almost all the clergy, by the suffrage of the people who were then present, and by the assembly of ancient priests and good men. When the place of Fabian, that is, the place of Peter, and the degree of the sacerdotal throne was vacant, which being occupied by the will of God and established by the consent of all of us." So now we are in the 4th century, and I want to end the video by reading 3 final quotations from Saint Apatus of Milevis, Saint Jerome, and Saint Augustine. "You cannot deny that you know that upon Peter first in the city of Rome was bestowed the episcopal cathedra on which he sat, the head of all the apostles, for which reason he was called Cephas, that in this one cathedra unity should be preserved by all. Neither do the apostles proceed individually on their own, and anyone who would presume to set up another chair in opposition to the single chair would, by that very fact, be a schismatic and a sinner." And here is a letter written by Saint Jerome to Pope Damasus. "As I follow no leader but Christ, so I communicate with none but your blessedness, that is, with the chair of Peter. For this I know is the rock on which the church is built. This is the only house where the paschal lamb can be rightly eaten. This is the ark of Noah, and he who is not found in it will perish when the flood prevails." And we're ending this video by a writing by Saint Augustine of Hippo, who was Jerome's rival. "There are many other things which rightly keep me in the bosom of the Catholic Church. The consent of the people and nations keeps me. Her authority keeps me, inaugurated by miracles, nourished in hope, enlarged by love, and established by age. The succession of priests keep me, from the very seat of the Apostle Peter, to whom the Lord, after his resurrection, gave charge to feed his sheep, down to the present episcopate of Pope Heresies." Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I love you so much, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!